Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Thomas, for introducing the conference, and thank you for all the organisers for bringing together what feels like it's going to be a very interesting day. I was going to say a couple of days, but it's only one day, but there's lots of activities and some very interesting... I really like the way that you've organised it, that we give quite short talks and then go off and have discussions. I think that's very network learning, so that's really good. I'm Vivien Hodgson, as Thomas pointed out. I work in the management school at Lancaster University. I'm also a visiting OBEL chair at Aalborg, which I've been doing for the last 5 years. This is my last year, actually, very sadly. And in the context of my work, I'm very much involved, being a member of a management school, in professional development. And my background is basically in management learning and network learning. And as Thomas pointed out, together with David McConnell, we established the Network Learning Conference and now co-editors of the Research in Network Learning Springer book series. So that's me. I think, and Thomas already gave an indication of what is network learning, but I think it's really important for us all to make it clear what our understandings and key characteristics and principles that are important to us when we're considering network learning. So obviously, obvious to me, it is taking the conventional, now long-standing definition about promoting connections. And it's promoting connections between learners and other learners, between learners and tutors, and between the learning community and its learning resources. That is a standard, well-established conference. I missed the ICT bit out, because in a sense, for me, it's there. I mean, we live in a very digital world now, and more important is it facilitates connections. It is about the pedagogy, it's about the learners and how they connect with each other, with the learning community and resources. So to that extent, I think NL, network learning, aspires to be a learning approach that provides learning spaces for critical inquiry, analysis and reflexivity. These are important characteristics and principles that are significant for my perspective, at least, of network learning, and I think for quite a lot of other people. Collaboration and participation, dialogue are all important principles and characteristics of network learning, but also taking responsibility and having a critical awareness of one's position in the world and the impact you have in the world. So it has a very particular perspective on the purpose and the nature of the pedagogy and the learning space that it's creating. And increasingly, it's characterised, and this is going back to Thomas's point, by the adoption of both face-to-face as well as virtual interaction and discussions within groups and social networks. Basically, because we live in a totally digitally connected world. And whether you're in a classroom like now, or whether you're away from each other, the communication is mediated through digital technologies. And the other thing, I think, in terms of this conference, it's quite important to consider what we mean by professional development, because that varies as well. And in my context, it's very much in the context of the management field and working with people who are actually professionals in their field, mainly managers, mainly leaders of different kinds. And the programs that we offer, based on the ideas of network learning, are the constituent audience are people who are themselves involved in management development, management trainer, or are managers or leaders of various kinds in various sectors. So very quickly, I'll just refer to a couple of practical initiatives where we have tried over many years, in one case, to implement these ideas around network learning. So we have the MA in Management, Learning and Leadership, which is a long-established programme. It was originally directed totally towards people who are management trainers, management developers, but in more recent years, we encourage people who have management responsibilities or leadership responsibilities that are interested in their own learning, their own development, and also the people that they work with and within their own organisations. I won't go into a lot of details of the programme, but basically, as you can see, well, it's not that obvious, but the workshops, they were residential, whilst between the workshops, people worked in a virtual learning environment. It started off as Lotus, and latterly it's been in Moodle, and they work in action learning sets between the workshops in the first year, and then in the second year, it's nearly all online. The second year starts with a workshop, and each workshop has a theme, and between the workshops, they work in their action learning sets, and that's all done virtually. And I think what's important is the principles and the structure of the programme. It's based on the idea of a learning community. These are people who are working in their professional practices as managers, leaders. They could be in corporate, they could be in the health service, they could be in education, it could be in an NGO, the police, anything, public sector. The structure of the programme is based on a learning community. It has an open structure and curriculum. It has action learning sets, as I've mentioned, but it also has free choice of topics and coursework, and very significant from the perspective of the design of this programme is peer involvement in the feedback and assessment of assignments. So it's peer assessment to a large extent. And in order to fulfil the aspirations of the programme, some of the underlying principles are that value is attached to relevance, in so much that these people are all practicing professionals, managers. The programme has to be relevant to them. They have choice of topics that they do their assignments on. They're actually individual assignments, but they're working their action learning sets on these assignments, so people support each other through the process of doing their assignments. And there has to be a belief in choice in the direction and content of one's own learning, taking responsibility. And therefore, we have the view that one of the underlying principles was that there has to be opportunities to share in the planning and the decision-making of what takes place in the workshops in order to be able to complete the assignments and do the things that are relevant to them from their personal perspective and the groups. And of course, that's quite complex because everybody comes with different agendas, different interests. So there has to be, we feel, attention to the social and organisational processes that are going on within the programme. And I explain all of these because I think the thing with network learning is it is based on a social constructionist view or theory of learning that assumes that learning does occur through relational dialogue, basically. And, of course, that means there is a very strong interactional and emotional dimension to network learning. And I think this is one of the aspects that can get overlooked. Working in such environments, in these kind of ways, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of emotion, and that there almost has to be an acceptance of the complexity and the diversity is normal in such kinds of environments. It is not a well-controlled and directed environment. And that can lead to all sorts of excitement, but also lots of problems and difficulties which have to be acknowledged and addressed. So some of the research we've done, which I'll come on to in a minute, takes account of this. I realise I have no idea what the time is. So you said there would be a clock on here.
Well, sorry about that.
Yes, it's all your fault. But I do have a watch, so I remember to have a look. Anyway, before I move on to some of the themes and the patterns that have come up in our research, of particularly the mammal programme, but also some of the more recent work I've been involved in, which actually includes MSc in leadership practice and responsibility. In a way, this is a more structured, from a traditional perspective, kind of programme, but it's entirely online. There's a workshop at the beginning and there's a workshop at the end. And different faculty are responsible for the modules which run every 10 weeks through to the dissertation period. It's also a 2-year part-time programme. And it's very much based on the idea that our leaders need to be taking much more responsibility in a ethical, sustainable and organisational and moral sense. So it's a really interesting programme. But in order for it to work, as it will, we felt that it had to have a pattern and a rhythm to the modules, because there's different staff coming in at different times. It's all online. So it makes it easier for both the learners and the staff if there's a pattern and a rhythm to each of the modules. So it runs in 5-week blocks with this outline. Yeah, you can see it. Pattern of 5 weeks of activities, some of which are given to the group, some of which they select case studies to work on and then present. And actually there's also weekly WebExes, which I've put this very deliberately in. It's Friday morning at 11 o'clock, because this is a very international group, and it goes from Australia to Singapore to Africa, and 11 o'clock on a Friday works really well. And everybody can, people do participate, and it works across time zones. So if you want to do anything like this, remember 11 o'clock on a Friday. It's a very good time. And then it has action learning sets before and at the end. And finally, the other piece of work that I've been involved in over the last couple of years is what we've called the LUMSNet project. And in particular, the postgraduate, and in the second year we started working with undergraduates. It's been very interesting, very revealing in terms of working with staff in the management school, because it was felt in general, and management schools are well known for not being interested in taking on blended or online digitally supported programs. And there's research and articles written about this, a particularly nice article by Redpath on bias against online learning or blended learning within the management school sector. However, they're realising that you just can't ignore that we are in this very digital, created world that we now exist and work in. And so this has been a kind of capacity building activity to support staff to bring much more digital resources and pedagogy into their everyday teaching and learning practice. And I was telling Thomas, we've actually just made a video which we haven't quite completed. And the video is actually called Feel the Fear But Do It Anyway, the everyday experiences of your everyday digital learning experiences of the everyday lecturer. It's a brilliant video in the sense that it brings out just how fearful these people were when they began thinking about they have to design a mini module, in this case, for online learning. But if you look, we did an exercise looking at their values and in their teaching and learning. And if you look at it, they very much relate to network learning. They're very much interested in Lancaster, in the learners, in learning. It is a university that's known for its pedagogic values as well as its research values. So it was the technology that they were scared of. It wasn't the ideas and the pedagogical ideas, it was totally the technology. So that's kind of introducing some of the work that I've been doing. And now I'd like to look a little bit more at research that's come out of doing this work over 30 years, in fact. Because we ran our first, it was actually called a computer-mediated mammal in 1989. So it's been a long time and a lot of changes and a lot of developments. So some of the key themes that have come up in that research are these. I'll let you read them while I take a drink. So self-development or reflexivity, the social construction of identity, the shadow side of participation, I think that's a very important one to be aware of, heterotopia, learning spaces, and digital literacy and scholarship. I think the latter one has come up very much more in the context of the LumsNet project, working with staff, but it's relevant to whether you're looking at staff or learners. So I could spend the rest of the morning speaking on each of these, but I'll quickly go through some of the highlights of these themes. Self-development or reflexivity, and I hope you, I'll just make a passing comment on the paintings that go with these. We did an event some years ago, and a colleague and artist actually did some actual paintings. She's a conceptual abstract painter, and she did these paintings to represent these themes. So I won't go, I mean, we did a session on this recently in Aalborg, looking at these paintings, but they are very representative of each of the themes. I'll let you look at, you can look at them or you can listen to me. Originally, of course, when we started off, particularly with the mammal programme, it was very much embedded in a humanistic learning and education tradition, a Rogerian, self-actualisation, fulfilment, Tavistock Institute, all of those kind of things. That, this is very much the thing in the 70s and 80s. And I think the idea of the self, and this is reflected in this image, has become much more fuzzy in more recent times as we moved into a more post-structuralist, a more performative view of who we are and of the notion of self. And this has been particularly prevalent in what is Pat Clough has called the affective turn. And in the sense that there's been a move away from thinking of bodies only in terms of the human, and more in terms, in her view, of an open system where the open system is the relationship between life, information and technology. So it's very relevant when you think in terms of reflexivity in the context of network learning. And as she says, affect is what augments or diminishes the body's capacity to act and to engage and to connect. So it's actually bringing the visceral experience as well as the conscious or logical, rational experience into play, and goes back to the emotional and the complexity that I was referring to. And but it is about connecting. So so we're still using some of the, or it connects to some of the basic ideas of network learning, and the body's capacity to act and to engage and to connect, or equally to disconnect. The visceral experience and way we experience the world can help us to connect and disconnect. So I think ideas of self-development and reflexivity are changing quite a lot in this much more complex view of the human or of the body and in a way it started from Goffman's presentation of self, but it's become even more fuzzy. So as I was saying, within that context and that view of network learning, an important pedagogical principle that certainly underpins mammal and certainly underpins my perspective on network learning is the idea of taking responsibility, but not only for your own learning, you're actually in a learning community, or a community of practice, however you want to refer to it. But taking responsibility to achieve both your professional and personal development through the programme, not only you, but your learning community members as well. And a recurring issue that's come through the research on this, particularly looking at the way people experience the programme from either a phenomenographic or a discourse analysis perspective, is the importance of developing trust and acquiring a voice and social presence, and how one experiences self in taking responsibility. And all of that contributes to a construction of identity within the learning community, and the identity of oneself as a learner within that learning community. So the social construction of identity is, I think, a very important idea. It's an important idea, full stop, within all social situations and social institutions. But I'm looking at it within the particular context of the learning community. And it does take place through the relational dialogues that are created, and taking a discourse analysis of the different experiences people are having, both at the face-to-face and online level, the kind of things that we've been particularly aware of is the way in which gendered identities are constructed within these learning communities. And also, and I think this is really important, discourses of inclusion and exclusion. And it's almost imperceptible and unnoticed how these can manifest themselves. But you get to a point where you suddenly see someone is being excluded. But if you track back through the discourse, you can actually see the processes that led to that, which is very, oh dear, that doesn't look very good, Viola. And also, of course, as I mentioned, the identity of people as learners, and particularly in the context of professional development, a lot of people, certainly on our programs, they're in very high responsible position as managers, as leaders, and all of a sudden, after 20, 30 years of not being a learner in a formal sense, I mean, it is in a formal sense, they are learners again, and how they experience that identity being constructed within the learning community. And the learning community, I'll come back to the heterotopia aspect of the learning community, is a learning space in itself where norms of how to be and ways to behave are actually socially constructed. And everyone who's part of the learning community is part of that that process. So we come as educators, they come as learners, there's the institutional norms, there's their own organisational norms and expectations. All of these things create what is accepted as the norms of that community. But also it offers a context which learners can experiment with ideas of identity and language, and to explore ways that they can think about acting differently, and ways that can influence future activity beyond the learning context. So it provides a learning space for this to actually experiment with and use each other to experiment with ways that you wouldn't do in your normal everyday organisational life, because it would feel too risky. So the spaces that are constructed can be both supportive and liberating in that sense, but as I've already kind of inferred, they can also be constraining at different times for different people. So it's not necessarily everything is golden in a learning community, as it were. And now we sort of look more at the heterotopia notion of learning spaces, and this is where this image comes into particular relevance. because learning spaces have often been discussed as basically spaces of enclosure, where it is very clear how you're expected to be and to behave. And I think in a network learning programme, there's no reason to assume that it's not necessarily the same. There are clear boundaries, and as I say, some of those are socially constructed by the learning community itself, and some of them are constructed by the institution, either the university, the school, the institution of education as a social institution. And to that extent, we played with this idea of heterotopia, which is a Foucauldian concept. So within this, these images, they're very much bounded images of, these are the boundaries around educational spaces, whereas this much more looser image on your right is Morgan, the artist, by the way, is Morgan Tanton. Should give her credit for her artwork. Is the kind of, it's much more transient and temporary spaces to those of everyday institutional spaces and life. And as Foucault was suggesting with this notion of heterotopia, it provides space to imagine and desire and to act differently. Now, the very notion of it being heterotopia means it's no utopian. It's complex and difficult, but it's an alternative space to one that we're operating on an everyday life in a social context. And the last theme, which I'd like to refer to, is that of digital literacy and scholarship. I think this is really very important in the sense of, do we actually think that staff and learners have the necessary understanding, digital skills or digital scholarship to meet the requirements of designs of network learning? And I think it's the digital scholarship one that is probably the most critical one. People, on this programme that I've been working with, people from the management school, they all talk about digital natives and them not being digital natives. We've all heard these arguments. But the idea that students come into the university and have the digital scholarship and skills that are necessary to fulfil the requirements of the university or to move into a digital world of learning and development is actually, it's just not there. And that's part of our role, both to become much more competent as digital scholars ourselves across the board. I'm speaking to the converted here, but having worked with staff, most of them, they did use Moodle, but of course, everybody knows they use Moodle to deposit their PowerPoint slides. And, Moodle, for all of its problems, has a lot of potential and possibilities. And, of course, students themselves we all know, are spending all that time in Facebook and forming groups in Facebook. So there is a whole interesting area here, I think. And do we really understand the constraints and benefits experienced by users, learners and staff? And do we have the necessary understanding of the nature of digital scholarship to make network learning a kind of universal, not so much universal, but as an everyday kind of pedagogy and practice? Because it certainly hasn't got to that point yet, much as we'd like to. And I have a final thought here, which goes back to Haraway from 1991, where she made the point, the machine is not an it to be animated and worshipped and dominated. The machine is us, our process, an aspect of our embodiment. We can be responsible for machines. We do not dominate or threaten. They do not dominate or threaten us. We are responsible for boundaries. We are they. And look at you all on your machines. They are an extension. They are an extension of us. We are they. I think it's an interesting point to finish. And I have a few references at the end which relate to the research. Almost on time, Thomas.